Welcome to Town Hall. Dr. Dori Tunstall is a distinguished design anthropologist, celebrated author, visionary organizational design leader, consultant, and coach. As the renowned author of Decolonizing Design, a Cultural Justice Guidebook, she is a pathbreaker of progressive approaches that challenge conventional design paradigms that exclude and harm Indigenous cultures in order to decolonize them and champion diversity, equity, and inclusivity practices in communities and organizations. Please join me in welcoming Dori Tunstall.
So I also acknowledge that I am on the stolen Coast Salish land, specifically the ancestral lands of the Duwamish, the Suquamish, the Stillaguamish, and the Mickle-Shoot peoples. And I pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging, who maintain stewardship over the lands and the water. Now let me introduce you in terms of my ancestors. So I am Elizabeth Dori Tunstall. I am the daughter of Teresa and Joseph. I am the daughter of Raymond and Letha. I am the granddaughter of Dolores and Johnny, Betty and George. And I am the great-granddaughter of Katrina and Raymond. And I am descendant of many, many ancestors, known and unknown. Ashe. Now, acknowledging the lands from which I come from. So I was born in Columbia, South Carolina, which means I am technically not a Hoosier. In fact, I can get away with being called actually a Southerner. On the lands of the Catawba, the Pidi, Chicora, Adisto, Santee, Yamasee, and Chicora Waccamaw nations. I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, on the lands of the Kickapoo, Kaskaskia, and Miami nations. So welcome, thank you for coming out tonight. I am looking forward to talking to you about my book, Decolonizing Design, a Cultural Justice Guidebook. I'm going to specifically focus on the aspects of it that talk about anti-racist design. Before I begin, I want to give a shout out to the amazing design team who actually designed my book. Ina Agi is a Nigerian-Canadian illustrator who did all the amazing illustrations, which you'll see, some of which in the presentation. Sadie Redwing is a Lakota designer who did the cover of the book, but also the Mandela pattern that you're seeing surrounding me in the illustration. That's her work. And the interior of the book is done by Polymode Studio, which is a studio run by Brian Johnson, who is a Muskegon Indigenous nation, and by Silas Monroe, who is a African plus American designer. This is important because if you have read the book, that you know what a lot of what I'm trying to do is promote Indigenous, Black, and POC design. And so it was really important. So a shout out to MIT Press, who of course didn't necessarily have a Black and Indigenous team of designers to work with, allowing me to build my own dream team so that the form of the book align with the content and the message of the book. So I always do a shout out of the design team because it's so important to, again, support and be part of a community of Black and Indigenous and POC designers. So the book came to life in the summer of 2022, The Reckoning. And I wrote the book in response to a variety of things. So like the work that I had been doing when I realized it for about 20 years in my life. And the pressures that I was experiencing in 2020 were in The Reckoning after the murder of George Floyd, that I was receiving lots of phone calls. I received phone calls for all of these amazing, beautiful, young, racialized Indigenous people who had put in these DI leadership positions and were asking, I don't know what the heck I'm doing here. And the reason why they were calling me is that I had been Dean of Design at OCAD University for about 6 years then, and had done some stuff in terms of helping to bring about change. So at the same time the things were going on with the murder of George Floyd and the reckoning, that OCAD University had announced the results of our black cluster hire. So we had brought in 5 black full-time faculty, the first time in the Faculty of Design in 144 years. Thank you. You can clap louder. That's a good. That was a big thing. And so, and then organizations were calling me saying, what can we do? How can we help? We feel really guilty about the things that are going on in the world. And I took every call until there was not enough hours in the day for me to take enough calls. And so Victoria Headley at MIT Press called and said, hey, do you think you want to write a book? And actually 10 years before, I had not had a very positive experience with MIT Press. And so I was like, no, not really. no, that's okay. I'm really busy doing the work. But then she persuaded me with a key change in thinking. One was it only needed to be 30,000 words, because I was imagining 65,000 words, and I'm still doing the design. I don't have time for 65,000 words. But 30,000 words, you know, given my writing capacity, that's about 8 weeks of like really solid. And I had, because of the pandemic, about 8 weeks of really solid ability to concentrate, right? Because the world had slowed down enough. The other thing she said was MIT Press was trying to make amends. And I think she actually used the term amends because, like a lot of other people, I was just like, yeah, show me. But when we had the conversation, it was like, okay, I think they're serious about this. So I have the time. You have the resources. Provide me with some of the resources. And let me change the way you write your legal contracts. And let me build my own team. And let's make this book happen, because it's really important to be able to share both my professional and lived experiences so that people don't have to go through the same pain trying to change an organization, right? So the purpose of writing the book was so all those young people who have been put in these DEI positions, first, the organizations that will hire them will understand what it takes to do the work and how they need to be supported. And again, all of these young people who've been put into these organizations, and some of them not so young, you know, young is relative, that they understand. The way I put it is that doing this work is like getting punched in the nose. And you're bleeding. And you have to tell the people who punched you that you're bleeding and the reason why. And then you have to suture yourself back up afterwards. If you're interested in doing the work of decolonizing DEI, that's what it's like. Especially if you're in a gendered, racialized, sexualized body that is not the mainstream. So this book comes out of trying to understand what decolonizing design might mean and what it meant to me, and it's meant 5 things. Putting Indigenous first, dismantling the tech bias, which is a funny thing to say here in Seattle because my hotel is like, wait, is that Apple? Is that Amazon? Is that, right? The tech bias in the European Modernist Project, and I will break what I mean by that. Dismantling the racist bias in the European Modernist Project. Making amends through more than diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then always the question about, what's the money? What do you do with it? So prioritizing your existing resources in order to be a decolonizer. But I have 45 minutes, so I'm not gonna be able to talk about all of that. I'm gonna choose 2. I'm gonna talk about putting Indigenous first because I need to put Indigenous first. And I'm gonna talk about dismantling the racist bias in the European Modernist Project because again, as we were deciding what to talk about, that's the one that gets the heart of what you need to understand to move towards anti-racism in design. So what might decolonizing design mean in terms of putting Indigenous first? Again, shout out to Anna Aggie with a wonderful illustration of all of my confusions in terms of preparing the book. But again, at the center of that is putting Indigenous first. Because the difference between those of you who might be interested in DEI work and decolonization is understanding what is your positionality in relationship to Indigenous peoples and their struggle, fight, eventual triumph for sovereignty over their lands. So the land acknowledgement is not just about being a feel-good moment. The land acknowledgement is about recognizing who are the original custodians of the land so that when decolonization happens, you know who the land is going back to. Putting Indigenous first. Now, I've lived in many different places, and as you can see, I am racialized as a Black cisgendered female. I have a little bit of neurodiversity, but that's not always obvious. So I encounter the world based on how people position me in relationship to my gender and Blackness and other aspects as well. So I've lived in places where I've lived in Australia, where interestingly enough, Blackness and indigeneity are actually conflated. So they talk about Black folks, they are Black folks. They spell it with a K instead of a CK, but they're Black folks, right? That I've traveled to Africa, so I've gone back to Africa, found out I don't really belong because I am very much American. There are some differences, but again, that sense of holiness, like I spoke Amharic, so I can get around. So if I didn't say anything, I passed, right? And people treated me differently based on that. But I've had that experience. And Australia is actually where I learned how to really engage with Indigenous communities. That experience is what got me the gig at OCAD University, where I was the Dean of Design for up until June of this year. And when I went there, one of my colleagues, Indigenous colleagues, said to me, because he had spent a lot of time in the United States, he said to me, Dori, you have to understand here in Canada, it's not about black and white like in the US. It's about red and white. So the implication, he didn't say this part, but the implication is that I need to understand my positionality as a person of power in this institution, OCAD University, as a Black woman coming to lead a process of decolonization and Indigenous revitalization, because that was what they asked for when they were looking for a dean. And so I basically had to understand the history of indigeneity in Canada and what my position is. And luckily, there are brilliant scholars who are smarter than I am, who provide frameworks to help. And so one of the frameworks that really help, and unfortunately, you can't really read this, which is why you have to buy the book, right? Is that, so Eve Tuck and Kay Yang wrote this amazing essay called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And you should find it, it's online, it's free, it's brilliant. But the thing that was most helpful for me is that when I came to Canada, people kept talking about BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and POC. And I was confused because in the context of the United States, I understood that POC was a term that was created by Black women in order to create inclusion for the shared injustices that all kinds of women in the United States experience, right? So I was like, that's us, we're POC. What do you mean, how is Blackness excluded from POC-ness? And they said, Dori, let me explain to you the framework of what is called the triad of positionality in the settler colonial state. So, Tuck and Yang talk about there is the native. So those are the original custodians of the land. Then there are those who are slaves, enslaved people, who've been brought to provide excess labor on the land. And then there are settlers, those who have left their homelands in order to come and build a good life on someone else's land. That, for those who are not sure, that's like the definition of colonization. So when I talk about decolonizing, what we're trying to address is the fact that a group of people, for the last 500 years or so, it's been Europeans, but it's not always been Europeans, got on ships, boats, trains, planes, automobiles, left Europe to build a good life, in this case in the United States, in Canada, in South America, in the Caribbean, in New Zealand, in Australia, in many different places in the world, but I'm going to mostly talk about North America. So, when you live in a settler colonial state, like the United States, you generally are one of those three positions. Now, even tech are very careful about ascribing specific identities, right? Because it's fluid. For example, if you are native, natives were also enslaved, right? It's actually the fact that the failure to successfully enslave indigenous people because of diseases and mass murder that Africans who had immunity to European diseases were imported, right, to work as excess labor. So again, black folks, generally in the United States, the enslaved population. And again, POCs, people of color, come often as settlers. Now, the interesting thing is that most of the time they are fleeing colonial structures that have destroyed their homelands in order to build a better life here in the United States. And the thing that's even also important to remember is that Europeans fled their homelands due to colonial structures in order to build a better life in the United States, and I'll get back to that one later. But it's understand is that all of us have this different positionality to the land. What is your relationship to the land? And we also have a different positionality and relationship to the assimilationist policies of the state, to the extent to which the state will allow you or not allow you to practice who you are through culture, and what I say is through design. So it's important to understand this positionality because it means we all have a very different relationship to design and what it is and what it's meant to do and how it can help us build a better and more just society. Now, the strategies that inform the positionalities have been different, especially here in the United States. So, one of my favorite books is Custer Died for Your Sin by Vane Deloria Jr., Dr. Vane Deloria Jr. And he talks about in this chapter, The Black and the Red, how white folks structure the relationships between black folks different from indigenous folks, right? So with black folks, Deloria Jr. says, is that it was really about exclusion. So we're going to exclude you from programs, policies, social events, and economic schemes. Sounding a little familiar, right? But with indigenous people, it was opposite because, you know, I mean, we talk about Thanksgiving, you know, there's a way in which they felt indebted for the fact that indigenous people took care of them when they were dying as economic refugees. And they had treaties that they had to respect, nation-to-nation treaties, right? Nation to nation. So the strategy had to be different. And so what they sought to do is turn indigenous people into Anglo-Saxons. That means we're going to include you so much that we will put your children into boarding schools to remove them from their culture, their language, their religion, their family, in order for them to assimilate into whiteness. And in the words of the founders of these institutional structures, kill the Indian, right? So the strategies were different. And this is important because I think coming out of the reckoning A lot of the people who moved into position of power after that were black women. And it makes sense. Black women are like one of the most educated. If you're an organization that was ticking boxes, oh my gosh, you get to tick. And if it was a queer woman, you get to tick 3. Oh my gosh. And a queer neurodivergent woman, you get to tick 4, right? But it's a thing I always feel a little bit weary of because it's the rhetoric amongst us black folks, right? So we talk about reparations. We want our 40 acres and a mule. And I always say, from whom were those 40 acres coming, right? Because this is in some ways, this is the spot that we sometimes as black folk don't always see, right? The way the structures work, let's say, again, strategy, let's exclude all black folks from the system, which means, what are we trying to do? We're trying to hustle into the system, right? This is the space of DEI. How do we hustle into the system? Decolonization, the perspective of indigenous people is different, because indigenous people say, let's burn this down, right? So you have a little bit of a clash going on, right? So again, you put me potentially into leadership, and I'm like, I'm gonna be in the system, but I'm gonna maintain the system because I'm trying to get in the system. You put an indigenous person in leadership, and they may burn the thing down. So one of the things we have to be careful of, black folks, and our positionality is, are we part of the wedge, right? Are we part of the erasure? Are we complicit in a system that keeps colonization in place for indigenous folks? Now, that's like at the big epic level. At the interpersonal level, because I've had, again, the amazing experience of being in community with very generous indigenous people, is that I screw up all the time. And the lovely thing is that, like I said, I'm in a loving community of indigenous people who are willing to tell me when I've made mistakes. And at first, that was really hard to take because, I was a leader. But it took me a moment to realize, to call me out is an act of love. It is an act that says, you are doing something that is creating disharmony in our relationship. And so I am telling you what it is so that you can stop doing it and make repair, make amends. So once I took my ego out of the equation and I really listened, then it was like, okay, what am I doing wrong and how I can do it better? Now, there's 2 things that I've done wrong. First is not being present. And what I mean by that is, like, again, as I explain in the narrative of, like, the boarding schools and whatever, like, the trauma that indigenous communities have experienced is not only heavy, it's actually fairly recent. Like, the last boarding school closed in, like, 1969 or something like that. And this is when you talk about, these are people talking about, like, my colleagues, my friends are talking about their grandparents. Like, their grandparents being in these boarding schools, experiencing all kinds of things that are unmentionable but have to be mentioned, right? And so when we go, for example, we had cultural competency training where we talked about the boarding schools, we talked about all those things, and I found myself shutting down. Not because I felt guilty, which was the experience of some of my settler colleagues, right? I shut down because it was resonating too strong, because in my community, right, being removed from your families is maybe only great-grandparent back, or maybe great-great-grandparent back. So, that epigenetic memory, right, of cultural removal, it is not an accident that my name is Elizabeth Tunstall. It is not an accident that my first language is English. It is not an accident that African Americans had to create whole new genres of music and food and all these things because they were prohibited from practicing even the drum. Like everyone talks about tap dance. Tap dance was an act of rebellion where we had to build the rhythm in our bodies because we were prohibited from using drums to express ourselves. And so I have a good therapist. I have very generous and loving friends, and they've taught me to be present. In Canada, on September 30th, which is coming up, is the Orange Shirt Day, where they again recognize and have events that address the deep, deep pain right now in the finding of children's bodies still on the grounds of these residential schools. And last year, I attended, and I was present because I got called out before for not being present, not speaking, not showing up because I was overwhelmed, but my not being present was hurtful to my Indigenous colleagues who wanted me to be there with them. So I've learned to be present, but it's something I've learned, screwed up on, and had to make amends. The one that is still and probably will remain the most challenging for me is colonize time and task. So my first professional job was at Sapient Corporation. So many of you, again, are high-tech sectors, you know. So you know it was fixed time, fixed price, which meant we were all about the time and task. In fact, you know, I think we had like the big five like all of our program managers were from like the big five accounting firms who like had these super matrices with Gantt charts and risk evaluations or whatever because it cost money if you ran over on time. So that was my first job. And again, I was like a user experience researcher. So we were on the beginning of that, which means we had to help plan out everyone else. So I am deeply colonized about time and task. And this is what makes it very difficult for me to work with my Indigenous colleagues and friends because they don't operate the same way. Let's say their process of decision making can sometimes be very, very, very thorough and very, very long. And I'm a doer. Like, I make stuff happen, right? I make stuff happen. And so when I walk into a project with my super beautiful Gantt chart and the question, which task are you going to take on in order to make this Gantt chart flow? I don't get responses to my email from my Indigenous colleagues. And then when I finally sit down and have the meeting, say, hey, haven't heard from you. You haven't decided what you want to do. I realize I've done the thing. And what's the thing? The thing is when you invite an Indigenous person to participate on a tiny little bit of your project that is only related to how do you build good relations with the Indigenous community. And I'm doing it on a clock. So when I did that once, again, a very loving, generous colleague, Camille Usher, called me out on it. And it was a great loss because it meant she didn't participate on the project with me. We're still friends. We still do stuff together, just not that particular one. And it's a thing that, again, I have to struggle the most with. But it's important to understand that they're operating at a different sense of time, right? Like when you're trying to be aware of the time of let's say a tree or a rock or water, like that epic time, not like super space time, right? But just the time of the things that are around you in the environment, which we might experience when you go camping and you're not trying to like rush to get to the traffic or whatever, right? When you're there and you're peaceful and the time goes differently. When you're trying to be aware of that time, then this Gantt chart is a problem because it is definitely not flowing on rock time. And it builds harmful and very, very painful relationships with Indigenous people if you're not trying to address that. So it's a thing I still struggle with. And like I said, I'm in loving relationships with many Indigenous communities because they continue to call me out, and I continue to learn and make amends. And that's a very, very important part of this process, is that you will screw things up. But if you are in relations, if you are in community, then people will call you out, and then you have the beautiful opportunity to make amends. And why is it that we want to make amends, especially in design? In the book I talk about, I reproduced in some ways a dialogue between Peter Moran, who is one of my colleagues, a member of the Tahltan Nation, and myself. And we were having a conversation about what decolonizing design means for him as like an Indigenous person, and for me as like an African American. And it was a lovely conversation. Like I said, you should read it. We're both funny and cute, and irreverent and deep and joyful. It's one of those relationships that are steeped in joy, because we can talk about the most painful experiences that our communities have, but we are so joyful to be, in some ways, the end point of those outcomes that we discuss with each other with lots of laughter and joy and just happiness, right? And so the thing that we found that was common around how we both approach decolonizing design was that we wanted to change what we designed for, right? What the purpose of design objects were, because in our communities, you would make something and you would share it with your family or share it with another community. And in that sharing, what you were trying to transmit in many ways is joy, connection, all the things that give us a sort of deeper meaning. And in some ways, you know, and I will talk this a little bit more in the second part of this, like, we've kind of lost our way. Because, like, how many are you in your design companies, like, the design criteria is for joy, or the design criteria is for liberation, right? Those are not our, but it should be. Like, why are we designing things that make people feel trapped? To make them feel disintermediated from their bodies and their labor and their cultures and their community. Why are we making those things in the world, instead of making things that reinforce connection and joy and liberation for our bodies and for our communities? Because that is what the original intent of design has been for, like, if you're in the Australian context, at least 65,000 years of making. So the purpose of doing all of this is we kind of, by putting Indigenous first, we begin to understand what we might be designing for in a different way, with a different understanding of all of our connections and all of our relations. And we put back at the center of what we make joy and liberation. Yeah, you're allowed to stop. Go ahead, you can stop. Okay, so to sum up this part, because, you know, I did work at consulting enough that you have to have key takeaways, right? So in terms of putting Indigenous first, figure out your positionality vis-a-vis Indigenous sovereignty over the land. Some people will be terrified. And if you are terrified, again, the thing that I remind you is that when most Indigenous people talk about decolonization, what they talk about is sharing the land. I have yet to meet anyone who's like, and we're going to put all the Europeans back on boats. We're going to put all the Africans back on boats, and we're going to send them back over to where they came from. Like, that rhetoric I have not heard or read anywhere in terms of the Indigenous struggle. They're just saying, you know, we said we would share things, and you're kind of not sharing, so can you, like, just do sharing? That's what we're asking for. And if you're worried about living under Indigenous sovereignty, just be useful. right? Don't harm, be useful. Because most of the time they want to keep you around if you're useful and you're not harming the kids, you're not harming the grandparents, you're not harming the land itself, just be useful. So understand your positionality. Learn the colonial histories of the place you're at. Like, the point of a land acknowledgement is that it's just the beginning. Just knowing where you need to start understanding what is the alternative perspective that I should have on the history of this land. And make mistakes. You will make thousands and thousands of them. But also make amends. And this is like for any relationship, right? Make mistakes, but make amends. And then when you do that, we begin to move towards, again, designing objects that can transmit liberatory joy to the body and community. So, into part 1, moving to part 2. How did we get here? This is the question. How did we get here? How did we get to the point where we stopped making things that were about liberatory joy? I will tell you. So we moved to dismantling the racist bias. And again, another shout out to Anna Aggie with her amazing illustration skills. And for those you don't know, so this is the mod. This is me not measuring up to the modular. If you're a movie buff, you'll see a little bit of like images of Modern Times by Charlie Chaplin. Because if you notice in the book, there's lots of film references. I must be a film buff or something. Okay, so now let's get to what is the European Modernist Design Project. So it's a myth. Once upon a time, in a place called Europe, there was a thing created called design. And through design, you would have technological progress that would bring to the masses a better life. And by removing allegiance to your ethnic and national markers, you can join in a universal humankind. Actually, they said mankind, but humankind, right? So this is a story we tell ourselves about design. And I'm afraid to tell you it's a lie. But I'm only going to tell you one part of the lie. Where does this myth come from? Okay, it comes from many places, but I'm a nerd, so I like to trace it through world fairs, especially this notion of universal humankind, because I get to practice my English accent. Okay. So you imagine yourself in London. It's 1851. You're walking around the great pavilions. You're looking at the work of everyone. Mostly Europe is there. Yes, they do have zoological exhibitions on all of the quote-unquote exotic peoples of the world, just so you know. And then you have this language that's being used to describe that sounds very, very close to this notion of like, let's just all give up everything and become part of humankind, right? Universal humankind. So forgive anyone who is English, forgive my fake English accent. It's just so much more fun to do it this way. Okay. So let us all earnestly pray that divine providence, which has so benignly watched over and shielded the illustrations of nature's productions, conceived by human intellect and fashioned by human skill, may still protect us. And the grant that the interchange of knowledge resulting in the meeting of enlightened people in friendly rivalry may be dispersed far and wide over distant lands and thus be showing our mutual dependence on each other, be a happy means of promoting unity among nations and peace and goodwill amongst the various races of mankind. So you see, they were saying mankind. Okay, so this is the articulation of that vision, right? And it makes sense in the context of Europe, because Europe is a place that has thousands and thousands of years of constant conflict. Right? Constant conflict. So the idea of let's get rid of your Englishness and your Frenchness and your Germanness, all these things that somehow keep us in conflict with each other and become part of a universal humankind, like the Swiss, right? This is a very, very enticing ideal. It's revolutionary. In fact, it was so revolutionary that many of the proponents eventually got kicked out, right? But in this story is a lie, because just a little bit after this was written, Europe is plunged into World War I, and what would follow World War I, World War II. And even in now, Ukraine, Russia, there is still conflict in Europe. So the idea of giving up your universal humankind, well, giving up everything that you are to become part of universal humankind, has been a lie in Europe. And let's continue to go back, because I love practicing my English accent again. So at the same time they're saying this, right? Let's all get together. Let's all be friends. They're also saying this BS. The productions of those who are commonly called Aborigines, or the less civilized races, are substantially the inferior fruits of human industry. The highly civilized man, rendered by science familiar with the works of uncivilized people, will soon come practically to aid them to acquire the superior qualifications that shall rightfully place them on his level. China and India have had so much in common with us in their manufactures, their arts, and their architecture, that they have made so much progress that already in many respects that purely Aboriginal products are comparably few in these countries. And okay, so we think, oh yeah, this is like 1850. We are so far beyond that. Except when you look at the QS charts of top design schools. Because guess which institutions are at the top? European ones, or maybe European American, or maybe European Australian. And then, what are the next kind of non-European ones to follow? China, and then India. And in fact, of the 200 schools that are listed, there are no African or Middle Eastern ones listed at all. So we still have maintained this great chain of being with Europeans at the top, Asians in the middle, and sort of everyone else being relegated to craft, ethnography even. And what does this do is that it says that for all of these other people, like the great diversity of making that is happening in the world, 95% of that making doesn't count, doesn't matter. How do you get away with saying like 95% of what is being made in the world doesn't matter? What justifications do you need to create in order to actively destroy what is being made? So let's go to the Bauhaus, right? Because this is where we see another manifestation of this. Now, I hate to break it to you, because I know many of you might be studying, history of design, and you haven't quite moved to the Bauhaus chapter, but let me break it to you. They were a little bit racist. Not even a little bit. They were like major racist. Now, in their excuse, their primary project was how to rehabilitate the broken bodies of minds of European male workers who had been devastated by World War I. So everyone talks like, why do you have all of a sudden like white rooms? Because you don't want to trigger post-traumatic stress disorder from someone who's been in the trenches. Why do you, again, moving to this notion of universal humankind, why do you want to get rid of all the Frenchness, Germanness, whatever, these markers of ethnic identity so that you don't trigger people who just a few years ago were fighting against each other? So again, it's not the problem that Itten or, they were actively catering towards white supremacy. That's not so much the problem. The problem is that somehow that got exported and amplified to become like, this is what we all should be seeking to achieve in design. Which again means not even 95%, means 99.99.99999% of people who are not traumatized white males who have experienced war face to face. that their designs get ignored. Their designs get denigrated. Their designs don't show up in awards. Their designs don't show up in annuals of like what's the best of. That all of us are seeking to somehow be someone that we can't be because we've been told that that is the pinnacle of what it means to be a designer. That is the pinnacle of design that we're seeking to achieve. To the point where what really got me interested in all of this is realizing my beautiful, diverse students at OCAG University, and they've said this to me, felt like they had to actively choose between their identities and being a professional designer. So, the European Modernist Design Project has a white supremacy problem at its roots. Now, because I'm a scholar, right? So let's talk about what I mean by white supremacy. One of those shocking things that I learned now in the past 5 years is that white supremacy has a time and a place. Time, 1681. Place, Maryland. And the beautiful thing about realizing that white supremacy has a time and a place, it means it wasn't there from immemorial. Jacqueline Baccaloria talks about the birth of white supremacy. And what she says is that, so there was a rebellion, and the rebellion was made up of European indentured servants, freed blacks, and enslaved blacks. And they all got together because they realized their oppressors was the aristocratic class who was exploiting their labor. So they got together, they had the rebellion, and this freaked the aristocratic class of the colonies out. So what did they do? They enacted laws, anti-miscegenation laws, which means black can't get with white can't get with red. And the interesting thing about these laws is that their intent was, again, to drive a wedge between white, black, and indigenous. And they did so not by uplifting the white race, but by pushing blacks and indigenous so far down that white people said, hey, we don't want to hang with them anymore. We see our alliances with this aristocratic class. What are some of the things they did? They said, white women, if you marry outside of the white race, you will lose your citizenship. They said, hey, black folks, we know you are free, but you can't carry guns to defend yourself if someone tries to re-enslave you. They said to enslaved people, guess what? No one, even if you have a quote-unquote good master, that they can no longer free you. They said you can no longer vote if you're not white, that if you are white and Christian, right, because you had to be Christian too, if you are white and Christian, we will no longer whip you naked in the public square. That was the benefit. So it pushed everything down, so it created a wedge between white working class and everyone else that, as we can see in our elections, still exists today. The implications of the fact that white supremacy is at the center of how we design is it means that those who are, again, are not white males who are experiencing trauma of the post-war period, that they don't get designed for, right? That women don't get designed for. I mean, it's only recently that we now test sanitary pads with real menstrual blood and not water, right? It means queer bodies didn't get designed for. Bodies with disabilities, racialized bodies, indigenous bodies. Now, again, there are people who are working to that, and even though you can't see it very clear because it's very dark, like there's a whole list of bibliography of people who are working to address that. But it means that the bodies that we design for in design are not everybody. And then it creates a culture of white supremacy. So this is where the work of Kuhn It's been really important in terms of white supremacy culture because it means like you could put as many black, female, indigenous CEOs at the head of all the organizations, but if you have not changed the underlying structures, white supremacy will still be in place. It's just inhabited by brown because it's, again, the water we swim in. It's the water we swim in. So how do we change the culture? Can we please not have a sense of urgency so that I am constantly pulling all-nighters to try to get a project done for a client? Yes. Can we have like realistic expectations so that I can spend time with my family and do work, right? These are the kinds of values that need to be changed in design. So it's not just who you're designing for, it's the underlying values by which we design that needs to be transformed as well. So, the modernist project design has excluded and continues to exclude almost everyone who is not, like again, of a very particular Bauhausian, master figure. And this, again, creates distress for those who love design, who love making, who don't fit into those bodies, doesn't fit into that idea. And again, the work that needs to be done is uprooting the white supremacy that exists in design, not just who we're designing in terms of the bodies, but also the underlying values, which drive how we set up our design firms and our design projects and our design practices. Again, me going back to my colonized time and task. And again, diverse designers are doing this work for us and by us, but we can't do it alone. Like I always say, the work of decolonization is the work of white folks. Because basically, y'all put the systems in place. Y'all benefit from the systems. So if you get over your addiction to the benefits of white supremacy, that's how it's going to fall down, right? That's how it's going to fall down. And you know where all the levers, right, that keep the systems in place. So you're like, oh, we're going to take out this monkey wrench and it'll fall down, right? Where I have to like first get access, then figure out where it is, and then actually then try to like pull that out, right? Because I'm not have the right leverage, right? So the work of decolonization is the work of white. Now you need me. You need us, diverse folks, because we need to tell you where the pain lies in the system. Because you can't see it. You can't feel it. Because the system's design is to make it painless for you as much as possible, right? So we have to say, actually, not cool, this is hurting. But you have to go in the work and do the dismantling yourself. And there's ways to do that. Like, again, I'm not throwing out the Bauhaus, baby with the bathwater. When I was in Australia, we figured out a way through the power of reconciliation to bring it together. So I taught a class with Dr. Norm Sheehan and other many Indigenous peoples, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, where we took Indigenous principles, respect, know, care, and share, and we aligned them with the Bauhaus kind of universal principles, right, like of how people see point, line, and plane. And it was really amazing because it showed that what was the problem with the Bauhaus is not necessarily the work that they did in terms of trying to kind of create a common language. The problem was the underlying consciousness, right? That white supremacy, we're just supporting broken and spiritually and physically broken white male bodies and screw everyone else, right? So by putting them in a framework of Indigenous principles, and again, a lot of what underlines Indigenous principles is this notion of interdependency. This notion of I am kin to all my relations, whether that's the water, the rocks, the air, the other animals. And they set up a beautiful cultural systems to support that. Like why you have a totem, you are wolf. That means you have responsibility for wolf and the environments that the wolves live in. You have an obligation to make sure wolves are around. And someone else has otters, and someone else has beavers, and someone else, like the whole entire ecosystem is covered. And you are part of that system. Like that's Indigenous cultural wisdom to build interrelationships with all things on which we are interdependent in order to live. These are the values that we need, again, to underpin our design. Don't have to throw out point line playing. Don't have to throw out color or rhythm or all these things. Just recontextualize them within a set of values that are not about harming superiority, not about pushing other people down in order to feel bigger. So, how do we do this? Well, okay, we all have our different roles. As I said, white folks, you need to do the healing of your own intergenerational trauma. Because I said before, the definition of a settler is someone who had to leave their homes due to colonial damage. The things that England practiced in Canada and the US were first practiced on the Irish and the Scottish. Like, it's really fun to talk about. Like, I've had some of my faculty members at OCAD University were Scottish, and so to have the decolonization conversation with them was extraordinarily enlightening, and for some reason had a lot of profanity in it. But again, understand that there's when you get on a boat not knowing if you're going to live and die in order to escape something, it's because home is not a safe place. You carry that trauma, and then the thing that happened is that trauma then got inflicted on Indigenous peoples and African people because y'all didn't visit your therapist. So deal with your own intergenerational trauma. Game of Thrones is only a fictionalization of the real thing that happened in terms of horrible ways and white-on-white violence happened, right? Deal with it. Address it. Don't use amnesia. Don't run away from it. Deal with it and be present with it, because that is what allows everyone else to be in good relationship with you, is you are doing your own healing. Those of us who've been excluded, we have to continue to claim and reclaim our stories of making, right? Again, the myth, 1800, there was a lot of stuff that was happening pre-1800 in terms of making that we have to re-embrace, right? That we have to re-embrace and demonstrate how amazing and wonderful it is within our own context. And, again, this is about power as well. So y'all in design firms and institutions, community organizations, y'all need to cede power and space to those who are non-white, male, able-bodied, Christian, et cetera, et cetera. Because as I said before, white supremacy is very addictive. Very, very addictive. Like, even for people who are not white, it's addictive, right? And so the only way to see what other possibilities would be, other possibilities of leadership, other possibilities of design, is to cede space to those who may not be as addicted to the structures of white supremacy and see what it is that they do to build community, to build an office culture, to build designs and innovations. And so you kind of need to shift to that. Doesn't mean everyone has to go away, but it just means, again, share more generously than is being shared now. So what might decolonizing design mean? These are the things that it means to me. But my provocation is to figure out what it means for you. I've provided you some tips, so I didn't leave you in theoretical land. I've tried to make it as practical as possible. I've left you some tips of some of the things that you might want to explore and think about. But you really do have to figure out from your own lived experiences, from your own professional experiences, what decolonization means to you. Indigenous sovereignty will come for a variety of reasons that you may not be aware of. The fastest growing population is actually Indigenous peoples, right? We have now realized that capitalism is an epic failure, right? And so something else is going to come, and the people who are still connected to potential ways, right, before capitalism are Indigenous peoples around the world. So we need to listen. We need to be humble. We need to put them first so that they can help guide the way. Yeah. And so decolonizing design means to me putting Indigenous first. dismantling the tech bias of the European Modernist Project, dismantling the racist bias in the European Modernist Project, making amends through more diversity, inclusion, and equity, and again, the money question, reprioritize your existing resources in order to decolonize. So thank you very much.
Architecture question. Columns are a design-heavy colonial influence on buildings across the country. Howard University embraced this. How can it transition to a more culturally relevant design that embraces their mission?
What was the first part?
Columns.
Columns, like.
Mm-hmm.
I would say columns have been a universal trait that is not just about the Greeks and the Romans or whatever. So I don't think columns are the colonizing force that one thinks it could be, right? Like there's great, but again, what it points to is that there's so much more work that needs to be done to understand architectural forms that exist in different places. So again, I was watching, this documentary on Indian architecture. And they talk about the fact that there's these 4 pillar columns. I don't even know where because it was late at night. But there's somehow the column that is holding up the cave structure, whatever, actually doesn't touch the ground at the bottom. And again, contemporary scientists can't figure out how that works. But again, somebody figured out how it works because it's been working for thousands and thousands of years. And so again, it's a thing where, like, again, it's the beauty of the availability of information that we have today is that, like, again, I think that actually, that appealed on a reel on Instagram, which then led me to go watch the documentary on YouTube. That I have now, there's the ability for us to learn so much about other ways of making in the world. One of my colleagues who's of Indian heritage and is an Indian dancer as well, so it's architect and dancer, talks about like the schematics for mostly Indian architecture was through dance. That the actual dance movements just helped. So again, because like they're not necessarily drawing blueprints, helped understand how you build the religious architectural form. So the dance form and the architectural forms were connected. You danced out what the building was supposed to be. Like, I mean, again, I know people have studied this because I know it and other people have told me this. But I was like, there is not enough exploration of this, right? Imagine not only that we understand that, but let's say through that understanding, we begin to develop contemporary architectural forms that are based on dance moves. The steps give you a sense of how big the building needs to be. How, imagine, because, you know, like, for example, we design buildings now so much based on the visual, which is why when you go into a restaurant, you can't actually have a conversation with the people across from you because the resonance of all the things bouncing off the chrome or whatever is destroying your ability to understand each other. Well, imagine if we designed buildings from dance and music, and that meant you had to pay attention to the acoustics. You had to pay attention to the way in which people needed to move through it, not just from a user experience perspective, right, in terms of functionality, but like how it made them feel good, how it changed their body, right? So these are, I mean, like, people like, where does innovation come from, right? Innovation doesn't have to come from what is new. Innovation can come from just understanding in many ways and more deeply, right, old ways of knowing that we've said didn't matter because it wasn't serving the purpose of, you know, post-war traumatic white men. And again, nothing wrong with being a white man. It's just the problem that's been everyone who is not a white man are being asked to be white men, right? That's the problem, not being the white man, just that everyone's being asked to do so. Imagine how beautiful it could be to have that richness celebrated in everything that we do. how much more innovation would come from that. Not that which is disruptive, but that works, let's say, harmoniously through cultures, harmoniously with the environment, harmoniously with the way in which we need to feel, again, liberatory joy with one another. So the columns are not the problem, but the columns point out how much more work it needs to be done to really understand the diversity of column making that is happening across time and space. Because there's so much richness there that we, again, have only begun to not necessarily understand, that we've begun to value, right? Because there were some who understood all the time. Now we just have to value what they have to say about the things that they make.
I am trained in human-centered design, and it sounds so beautiful. But I'm just curious, like, how, just your thoughts on that, about how, like, colonialization not only comes in our systems, but also just in our education. It's at everywhere we turn. Sort of, how do we see that? How do we know that we're in it when we're being taught it? I went to University of Washington, definitely a European-grown university. And so I'm just curious, like, you know, Don Norman gets lifted up so much in design, but who came before him, and, like, why are we not taught that? So I'm just curious, like, how do we get out of it, colonialization, when we're literally being taught the methods of going out into community are based on that as well?
So there's two ways to approach that. The beautiful thing about human-centered design is that you can definitely broaden the humans that you're engaging with, right? So it's like, yeah, Don Norman, I've met him many times, a really nice guy, but there are other humans that we can be engaged with, right? And so you know, like, part of my professional work has been saying, yeah, we're going to talk to humans, but what if we talk to these humans as well as these humans, right? And then, oh my gosh, they think and do things differently. Let's learn more. Oh my gosh, this is really amazing, interesting things. We should elevate, right, the importance of what it is that they're saying, right? So that's one method that we just use, which is, again, keeping it human-centered, but saying, hey, there's a variety of humans that we can be engaged with. Let's explore, because you know what? We might learn some different new insight that will drive some innovation that we weren't able to understand before. Now let's not do it in a way that's exploitative and extractive. Let's make sure that we're providing equal benefit. Oh my gosh, there's an innovation that needs to come out of that, because we need to rewrite our contracts in the way in which we pay them in order to be able to do so and engage within a respectful way, right? So that's one approach that I've taken, because, again, being user experience researcher, that's like, what is the area in which I have decision-making control? I could decide which humans we engage with. Oh, guess what? I'm going to choose something differently than what they expect, right? The other way is to decenter the humans. I'm always so at OCAD, I was trying to always get my faculty to do a class where it's like, okay, let's do architecture for cats and rats and roaches all together, right? Because the idea of, like, human beings being like the center of the entire universe, that is colonial, right? Other people say, I mean, again, there's like whole cultural systems that were put in place to decenter humans, right? To say, you are wolf clan. The wolf is more important than even you, right? So there are ways in which, by moving outside of that human-centeredness, how do we design with and for the air, the water, the animals, the land, the people, the minerals, the flora and flora, and how human beings all fit within that. And again, it introduces complexity, but through that complexity comes innovation that benefits all, right? Not just humans. Because right now we've been making a lot of design decisions that benefit just humans, except it's not benefiting us anymore, because nature is saying, guess what? I'm going to have an earthquake because you keep fracking me off, right? So I think that's the other approach that we take, is we begin to decenter humans so that we take on, again, like what does it mean to design for all my relations, right? The Anishinaabe talk about that, like all my relations. How do we begin to do that? And like I said, we have great cultural models of how to do that. We've just been told that they are not valuable. And so, again, being in good relations with Indigenous communities who already get this, that there is an openness for us to be able to learn with humility, with humbleness, not with the intention to extract and take and, commoditize and then be able to make ourselves a billionaire, right? And then buy land in Hawaii that belongs to Indigenous people. But we were able to do so in a way that builds true community. Again, not just with diverse peoples, but also with diverse ecosystems as well. So those are kind of like the two directions. Like earlier in my career, it was easier for me to do, like I said, let me just choose the humans because that was the only power and control they gave me, right? As I change the scope of my impact, then I try to move more towards like, oh, let's figure out what the decentering human experience looks like, right? When we just put us in the nexus of relationships with others, right?
What's your recommendation or about not losing steam, right? Because not all of us have this ability to be up in the food chain. Like many of us, the darker you are, tend to be quieted or kind of pushed away. Like I think as we get these small wins, right, celebrate those. But what's your recommendation to not lose steam, like just from your perspective?
So I'm a firm believer of like the nap ministry. Like my job is to try to be as lazy as possible. And again, that sort of, again, colonial time and task thing works against that. But also I could use it to build in breaks. So this is why you need community, right? Like the work that I do or have done, or even the space I'm in now. So again, in July, I left doing the work at OCAD University. Why? Because it was freaking exhausting. But also, again, because I was in community with people, I was able to say, hey, why don't you take this on? Because I need a break. I need to rest. And you have the energy, you have the interest, I'll be there to help guide you. But isn't it lovely to not have to do the work? And I might have to come and pick it up in some different way. But when you're in community, you can look at each other and sort of say, what's your name? Yeah, Izzy. Izzy is not looking very healthy right now. Izzy, what are you up to? Let me take this on for a little bit. You go take a nap, right? Get some, fresh juice, go walk outside, do a forest bath or whatever that you need to do in order to recharge yourself. Now, because I'll give this back to you because it's heavy and I can't carry it all by myself. I mean, you've been carrying it by yourself, but, we can share it, right? So being in community is really important to sustaining. It's a relay, right? It's a relay. Let me hand this off to you because I've run out of steam. Let me hand this off to you. And I might have to come back, right? But I'll come back refreshed and with a greater sense of purpose. And that's part of the problem is like we've been so taught that I have to do everything by myself. And again, I say this with complete and total hypocrisy, right? So I say it but it's my learning, right? It's my learning to say, okay, someone wants to care for me. It is important for me to let them care for me. It's important for me to sit down and rest. Because, and again, people say, it's like if your cup is empty, you can't give it to anyone else. You can't give to the purpose, the movement, the motion, the whatever, the struggle, if you're exhausted. And again, the purpose of capitalism and racism and all of these systems is for us to be so exhausted that we just accept the status quo. So we need to rest, we need to recharge, we need to rejuvenate so that we remember what we're fighting for. We're fighting for the joy, right? Not the drudgery. And so being in community is really important. And you may not have it in your immediate community. Like there was points of times where it's like, whew, thank you for the internet, because that was the only community of like-hearted people I was able to connect with for a while before I brought enough people, in a closer orbit who shared the same values and approaches and that I could hand things off to. And again, it could be, it starts with just like on your team, right? And that's the act of caring for each other, is to making sure that someone's not getting overexhausted, that someone is able to continue the struggle, and someone doesn't feel alone in the work that they're doing. So those are kind of, I try to be as much in community and share. I try to be as honest as possible about when I am tired and things are really heavy, and entering that space of vulnerability, because you don't know if people are going to care or not that you're in that. And again, understanding that an act of care is me looking at others and saying, okay, let me carry this a while for you, right? It may be heavy if I carry it too long, but I know it's too heavy for you because you need to recharge. And that's the most and best that we can do with and for each other.
Do you have a good place to point us to look for inspiration or examples of people who have done the work to decolonize design?
I wrote a whole book on it. And in that book, I actually mention a lot of people. It was very, and I'll frame it this way. Like, I worked really hard with the indexer, right? So that's the person who goes through and say, okay, this is on this particular. So like the indexer said, she over-indexed because I had said that there are so many people that I want to make sure they're highlighted. Like even my dog has an index code, right? That I want to make sure that so many people, I want to amplify the fact that so many people are doing this amazing and beautiful work. And that's actually also how I keep recharge, because there's times when I do feel like I need to stop doom scrolling. But then I remember but there's also people who are doing this work, and I just need to reach out and connect with them. So I pack the book with so many people who are doing amazing work, because again, that's my community who keep me going. They're the community that I'm most in dialogue with, and they're and again, part of this stuff is really heavy. So part of a way of not despairing is to realize that there's so many people who are doing work, and they may do it on their own little space in which they have, agency to be able to act, but they're still pushing, right, for the change. They're still changing and learning and growing. And so I try to mention and have indexed as many people as possible that fits within 30,000 words to be able to show that there's so many people who are doing this work. So, I mean, it's a plug to read the book by. See, you already have it. So it's a plug to read the book because there's a direct intentionality for me to connect as many people possible with others who are doing the beautiful soul work that needs to happen in the world. Thank you.